On April 6, 2000, the atmosphere over Salem, Oregon was characterized by a thin, persistent drizzle, the kind of mundane Pacific Northwest weather that local residents like Howard and Martha Miller had navigated for over 40 years. At 7:02 a.m., the neighborhood was waking up to the sound of tires on wet asphalt, but at the Miller residence, the day had already been in motion for 2 hours. Howard, a man whose professional life as a structural engineer had instilled in him a permanent distrust of the unplanned, had already performed a pre-trip inspection of their 1998 sedan. He checked the oil. He checked the transmission fluid. He verified that the spare tire was inflated to exactly 32 pounds per square inch. This was not a man who vanished by mistake. This was a man who planned for the friction of the world. At 8:19 a.m., Martha Miller placed a final set of containers in a small cooler. She was a woman of precise habits, a retired head librarian who categorized her kitchen with the same Dewey Decimal rigor she had applied to her stacks. Every item for their road trip was logged: 3 ham sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, 2 bottles of mineral water, a thermos of black coffee, and a bag of sliced apples. These items would later be identified by forensic teams not as food but as biological markers of a timeline frozen in stasis. At 9:14 a.m., the garage door hummed shut. A neighbor's security camera, primitive and grainy by modern standards, captured the silver glint of the sedan as it turned onto the main road. This is the first frame of the void. In the logic of a cold case, this moment represents the transition from the known to the unknown, the point where a human life begins to transform into metadata. The Millers were heading toward a family reunion in California, a route they had driven a dozen times. They had a GPS unit, an early consumer model, but Howard preferred the tactile reliability of a paper atlas. On the passenger seat, Martha had opened a 1999 Rand McNally, the route to Highway 70 marked with a steady translucent yellow line. At 11:45 a.m., they stopped for fuel. The receipt, later recovered from the silt, showed a transaction for 12.4 gallons of unleaded. The timestamp on the gas station's closed-circuit television showed Howard standing by the pump, adjusting his cap. He looked at his watch. He was on schedule. He was precisely where he intended to be. By 1:22 p.m., they were seated in a diner on the outskirts of the Plumas National Forest. The waitress would later recall them as the quiet couple. They didn't linger. They paid their bill, left a 20% tip, and walked back out into a sky that was beginning to turn a bruised, heavy purple. The mountains do not explain why the weather shifted so violently in the following hour. At 2:10 p.m., the sedan entered the Feather River Canyon. The road here is a masterpiece of engineering and a nightmare of geography, a narrow ribbon of asphalt pinned between sheer granite walls and the churning green water of the river below. At 2:38 p.m., the localized cell broke. It wasn't a storm, it was a deluge. The technical term is microburst, a sudden downburst of sinking air that triggers intense localized rain. For a driver like Howard, a microburst on a canyon road is a physical manifestation of a structural failure. The friction coefficient of the road surface dropped to near zero in seconds. Imagine you are in that car. The wipers are at full speed, a frantic metronome against the glass. You are leaning forward, hands at 10 and 2. You trust the machine. You trust the tires you checked at 7:02 a.m. But at 2:41 p.m., the car hits a standing pool of water where the drainage culvert has been blocked by forest debris. This is the moment of hydroplaning, a state where the vehicle is no longer a car, but a boat without a rudder. The sedan drifted. It didn't spin. It didn't scream. It simply slid with a terrifying silent grace toward a gap in the guardrail that shouldn't have been there. A construction crew had removed a 10-foot section of the steel barrier the day before to move equipment and had replaced it with temporary plastic pylons. To a car weighing 3,400 pounds moving at 50 miles per hour, those pylons were ghosts. The car left the road at an angle of 15 degrees. It didn't flip. It sailed into the canopy of the trees lining the bank, the branches acting as a soft, leafy shroud that muffled the impact and hid the trajectory from any passing motorists. No one saw the splash. The river, swollen by the rain, accepted the vehicle with a cold, indifferent hunger. The water began to fill the cabin through the ventilation ducts. Howard's last recorded action, evidenced by the position of the wreckage, was to reach for Martha's hand. At 2:44 p.m., the sedan settled onto the riverbed, 40 feet below the surface. The silence began. For 13 years, the Millers were not dead in the eyes of the law. They were merely missing. The grieving investigator, in this case a nephew named David, who had spent his inheritance on private divers and satellite imagery, obsessed over the GPS drift of the era. In 2000, civilian GPS had a deliberate error margin known as selective availability. This meant the Millers' last known ping was accurate only within a 100-meter radius, a radius that, in a canyon, covers a vertical mile of rock and water. David spent his weekends walking the banks, looking at the water, unaware that he was standing 20 feet away from his aunt and uncle's final resting place. The mountains keep their secrets, but they also preserve them. The water of the Feather River is low in oxygen and high in mineral content. As the years passed, the car didn't just rust, it became a geological feature. Silt settled over the roof, 6 inches deep. Freshwater mussels colonized the wheel wells. The silver paint disappeared under a layer of green-brown algae. To the casual observer or even a professional sonar operator in 2005, the car looked like a large flat rock. It was a masterpiece of accidental camouflage. The search efforts in 2001, 2004, and 2008 all failed for the same reason. They were looking for a catastrophe. They were looking for a scar on the earth, a burnt-out wreck, or a debris field. They weren't looking for a perfect silent entry. They weren't looking for the rule of irony, that Howard's expert driving had actually made them harder to find by keeping the car intact as it sank. The investigators interviewed the diner waitress. They interviewed the gas station attendant. They tracked the Millers' credit cards, which never moved again after that 1:22 p.m. lunch. They checked flight manifests. They checked border crossings. They even looked into the possibility of a staged disappearance, a theory that David found insulting. Howard Miller didn't leave his tire pressure gauge behind to start a new life. He was a man of the logbook. If he were going to disappear, he would have filed the paperwork. At 4:15 p.m. on that original day in 2000, the family at the destination called the Miller's house. No answer. At 8 p.m., they called the State Patrol. The dispatcher took the notes. 2 elderly citizens, silver sedan, Oregon plates. The void was officially open. For the next decade, that file sat in a cabinet in Quincy, California, gathering the same kind of metaphorical dust that was physically settling on the sedan at the bottom of the river. The case became a ghost file, too cold to be active, too mysterious to be closed. Every year on April 6th, David would drive to the canyon and drop a single yellow rose into the water. He didn't know why he chose that specific spot. He later told reporters it was just a feeling, a magnetic pull toward a bend in the river where the current seemed to hesitate. He was standing on the ceiling of their tomb. Why would the universe allow such a precise disappearance? The answer lies in the granularity of the evidence found much later. When the drought of 2013 hit, the Feather River dropped to levels not seen in a century. The Roki, quote, 5. Happened not because of a breakthrough in technology, but because of the raw, brutal physics of a drying planet. A diver named Elias Thorne was practicing deep water navigation when his fin struck something hard and rhythmic. Rock doesn't have 90-degree angles. Rock doesn't have a door handle. He wiped away a thick layer of slime and saw a reflected glint from a side-view mirror. It was the eye of the ghost looking back at him. He surfaced, gasping not for air, but for the weight of what he had found. He knew the story. Everyone in the county knew the story of the silver sedan. The recovery began at 6 a.m. the following day. This was the transition to the physical evidence phase. The crane arrived, its hydraulic arms silhouetted against the morning mist like a predatory bird. As the cable tightened, the river seemed to moan, the suction of 13 years of silt refusing to let go. When the roof finally broke the surface, the first thing the investigators noticed was the color. The silver was gone. The car was the color of a wet forest, deep greens, blacks, and the orange-red of oxidized iron. The windows were opaque, coated on the inside with a fine, ghostly dust of calcium carbonate. As the car was leveled on the flatbed truck, water poured out of the door seals in a steady, rhythmic stream like the vehicle was finally breathing out. The quote 6 began immediately. Item 1, a leather handbag, remarkably intact. Item 2, a set of keys in the ignition, turned to the on position. Item 3, a pair of dentures in a plastic cup, still sitting in the center console's cup holder. This detail, more than any other, broke the clinical distance of the forensic team. It was the ultimate mark of the mundane. You don't take out your dentures if you think you're about to die. You take them out because you're settling in for a long, comfortable drive. The experts began the reconstruction. They looked at the metadata of the tragedy. They analyzed the quote 7 of the car's final position versus the last known ping. They found that the car was only 42 meters from where the initial search had ended in 2000. 42 meters. The length of a swimming pool was the distance between a closed case and a 13-year nightmare. The grieving investigator stood behind the police tape, watching as the technicians used a hydraulic spreader to open the driver's side door. The smell, they said, was not of rot, but of ancient wet earth. It was the smell of the river claiming its own. Inside, the expert victims were still in their seats. They were still belted in. Howard was still holding the wheel with his left hand. The mountains don't explain why, but the evidence does. The evidence tells us that they didn't suffer. The impact with the water had triggered the airbags, but in 2000 those systems were often overpowered. The force had likely rendered them unconscious instantly. They didn't drown in a panic. They transitioned from a rainy drive into an eternal sleep. The reconstruction of the narrative truth reveals a chilling reality about our relationship with technology. We believe that because we are connected, we are findable. We believe that our preparedness, our logs, our maps, our highlighters, acts as a tether to the world of the living. But the Millers were the most tethered people in Salem, and they were undone by a 10-foot gap in a guardrail and a few inches of water. Imagine you are standing on that bridge now, looking down into the Feather River. The water is clear today. You can see the rocks, the fish, the swaying weeds. You feel safe because you have your phone in your pocket and a satellite overhead. But the river is still there. The silt is still moving. The road is still slick. The moral warning is etched into the very rust of the Miller's sedan. Preparation is a virtue, but it is not a guarantee. The world is larger than your map. The silence is deeper than your signal. To catalog the disappearance of Howard and Martha Miller is to catalog the slow erosion of human certainty. We look at the car on the flatbed, and we don't see a vehicle. We see a clock that stopped. We see the exact moment that the engineering of a life failed to withstand the physics of a river. The investigators took the car to a secure warehouse in Sacramento, where the air was climate-controlled and the light was fluorescent. There, the quote 10 sat in a plastic chair, watching as they peeled back the layers of silt. They found a roll of film in the glove box. They used infrared scanning to try and salvage the images, hoping for a clue, a reason, a sign. What they found were 3 photos of a sunset from the night before they left, a sunset they would never see again. The mountains don't explain why, but the photos remind us that they were here. They were real. And for 13 years, they were waiting to be found. Forensic technicians meticulously removed the dashboard, looking for the clock. They found it. The hands were frozen at 2:44. It matched the reconstruction. It matched the Doppler radar data from April 6, 2000. It was the final granular detail that closed the loop. The expert victim had been on time until the very end. The grieving investigator finally had his answer, but as he stood in that warehouse, he realized that the answer didn't provide peace. It only provided gravity. He looked at the mud-caked dentures and the rusted keys and realized that the mountains keep their secrets because we are too small to hear them. The river doesn't care about your tire pressure. The rain doesn't care about your library books. It only knows the path of least resistance. And on that Tuesday in April, the path of least resistance led directly into the deep. Every cold case is a lesson in the limits of the human will. We plan, we prepare, we map our lives with highlighter and sticky notes, but the void is always waiting. No signal, no trace, just silence, until the water recedes and the ghosts are forced to speak. The warehouse in Sacramento was a cathedral of clinical detachment, a stark contrast to the chaotic, silt-choked reality of the Feather River. Within these walls, the second phase of the reconstruction began, the granular dissection of the physical evidence. Forensic experts clad in white Tyvek suits approached the 1998 sedan not as a tomb, but as a data set. Every inch of the vehicle's interior was mapped using terrestrial LiDAR, creating a digital twin of the wreckage before a single object was moved. This is the obsession of the chronicler, the belief that if we can measure the displacement of the silt or the angle of a seatback, we can somehow negotiate with the tragedy. The car was positioned on a raised platform, allowing the residual river water to drain into filtered basins. This water was not merely waste, it was a medium that had held the miller's final moments in a chemical suspension. As the fluid receded, the interior emerged in shades of sepia and gray. The passenger side was a portrait of domesticity interrupted. Martha's seat was moved forward, consistent with her height of 5 feet 2 inches. In the footwell, investigators located a single shoe, a sensible walking loafer, its leather swollen but its stitching still holding. The rule of irony dictates that we find the most durable parts of a person in the things they bought to protect themselves. Beside the shoe was the cooler, its lid partially pried open by the pressure changes during the initial descent. The ham sandwiches, once carefully wrapped in wax paper, were now a dark organic sludge, but the wax paper remained translucent and mocking. At 10:14 a.m. on the first day of the forensic audit, the lead investigator, a man who had spent 30 years looking at the things people leave behind, discovered the logbook. Howard Miller's structural engineer's notebook was tucked into the door pocket, protected by a layer of silt that had acted as a natural sealant. Using a vacuum freeze-drying process, the lab was able to separate the pages without tearing the waterlogged fibers. The last entry was dated April 6, 2000, 11:47 a.m. It recorded the mileage, the price of gasoline, and a single mundane observation: wipers streaking slightly, replace in retting. This was the voice of the expert victim, analytical, forward-thinking, and entirely unaware that Redding was a destination he would never reach. The mountains don't explain why a man would worry about a streak on his windshield moments before the sky fell, but the chronicler notes it as a testament to the human spirit's refusal to see the end coming. To understand why the search teams of the early 2000s failed so spectacularly, one must analyze the psychology of the search. In the weeks following the disappearance, the focus was on the high probability zones. Search theory dictates that a vehicle leaving the road at high speed will leave a visible scar, broken saplings, disturbed soil, or a debris field of plastic and glass. The investigators flew helicopters equipped with thermal imaging, but they were looking for heat in a landscape that had already turned cold. They used side-scan sonar, but the technology of the era was plagued by acoustic shadows. In the deep, narrow canyons of the Feather River, the sedan had slid into a dead zone, a pocket of the riverbed where the granite walls reflected the sonar pings in a way that masked the car's geometric profile. The searchers were looking for a wreck. The river had created a reef. The grieving investigator, proxy for our own obsession, spent years studying these sonar logs. He noted that in the 2004 survey there was a slight anomaly, a lump on the river floor that didn't match the surrounding geology. At the time, it was dismissed as a fallen boulder. Why would they do this? Why would professional searchers overlook the very thing they were seeking? The answer is a phenomenon known as expectation bias. The teams expected a violent crash site. They didn't expect a car to have threaded the needle of a guardrail gap with such surgical precision that the surrounding foliage remained undisturbed. The mountains keep their secrets because we often tell them what we want to find. As the forensic team moved to the mechanical systems of the car, the narrative truth began to sharpen. The brake lines were inspected for signs of tampering or pre-existing failure. They were found to be in perfect working order prior to the immersion. The tires, despite 13 years under pressure, still held a measurable amount of Howard's 7:02 a.m. air. This was a critical finding. It removed the possibility of a blowout or mechanical sabotage. It narrowed the cause of the disappearance down to a single terrifying word: hydroplaning. This is the moment where the forensic becomes the poetic. Hydroplaning is the loss of contact. It is the moment the machine ceases to be a tool of the driver and becomes a victim of fluid dynamics. For 3.8 seconds, Howard Miller was not a driver, he was a passenger in his own life. The technical analysis showed that the steering rack was locked in a hard left turn. He had fought the water. He had applied the engineering principles of countersteering, but the physics of the Feather River were non-negotiable. At 1:30 p.m. on the third day of the audit, the quote 18 within the discovery occurred. Beneath the rear seat, a technician found a small waterproof plastic box. It was a time capsule of sorts containing the Miller's emergency kit. Inside were flares, a first aid manual, a heavy-duty flashlight, and a backup map. The rule of irony was once again on display. They were prepared for a breakdown, a flat tire, or a medical emergency. They were prepared for everything except the one thing that happened. The flashlight was switched to the on position. Howard or Martha had reached for it in the dark as the water rose above the windows. The battery had long since died, but the physical position of the switch was a silent scream across time. It told the story of the few seconds between the impact and the end, a story of two prepared people looking for a light that would never reach the surface. The forensic casual language of the report would later describe this as evidence of conscious effort post-immersion. The storyteller describes it as the most heartbreaking detail of the log. Imagine you are in that cabin. The light from the surface is fading as the car settles into the silt. You reach for the one thing that represents safety, the light, and you find that the world outside has become a wall of green-black glass. The investigation then turned to the metadata of the couple's life leading up to the trip. They looked at cell phone records, which in 2000 were sparse. A single outgoing call had been attempted at 2:42 p.m. It lasted 0 seconds. No signal. The canyon walls, the very things Howard had admired as an engineer for their structural integrity, had acted as a lead shield, blocking the digital plea for help. The mountains don't explain why they provide beauty and a prison in the same breath. The grieving investigator, sitting in his silent house years later, would look at that 0-second call log and wonder whose name was being dialed. Was it the family waiting for them? Was it emergency services? Or was it a final attempt to touch the world before it vanished? The reconstruction of the quote 21 focuses on these capabilities. Howard wasn't just a driver. He was a man who understood the limits of materials. He would have known, as the water reached the steering column, exactly what was happening to the electrical system. He would have known the door wouldn't open against the external pressure. He would have known that the engineering had failed. This is the burden of the prepared. They are the only ones who truly understand the scale of their own helplessness. The forensic team found that the window motors were fused. The glass had not been broken. They had sat in that silence, waiting for the river to finish its work. In the final hours of the audit, a macro shot was taken of the ignition key. It was bent. Not by the impact, but by the weight of Howard's hand as he tried to turn the engine over one last time, even as it was submerged. It was a futile gesture, a human reaction against the cold logic of the river. The mountains keep their secrets, and the river keeps its trophies. This second batch of evidence moved the case from a quote 22 file to a quote 23, but it left the quote 24 question vibrating in the air. If the most prepared among us can be erased in 3.8 seconds, what hope is there for the rest? The forensic image of the bent key remains the haunting center of the case, a symbol of the struggle between human will and the indifferent weight of the water. The investigators began to pack their tools, the Tyvek suits crinkling in the sterile air. They had found the truth, but the truth was just a list of items in a bag. The narrative. Truth, the one that David and the rest of the world sought, was still buried in the silence of the Feather River Canyon. Why did they drive into the storm? Why did the guardrail fail? The mountains don't explain why. They only watch as the water recedes and the skeletons are hauled into the light. The moral warning was becoming clearer. Your maps can only take you so far. Beyond the yellow highlighter line, there is a world that doesn't follow the Dewey Decimal System. There is a world of 42-meter misses and 0-second calls. And in that world, the only thing that remains is the memory of the light being switched to on in the dark. The warehouse in Sacramento became a silent courtroom where the third phase, the reconstruction, began to pull the narrative truth from the wreckage. While the first two phases established the what and the where, this third movement sought to answer the how and the who. This is the stage where the grieving investigator moves from mourning to an obsessive forensic pursuit of accountability. The discovery of the vehicle was not the end. It was the birth of a new set of questions that focused on the small, human errors that created a perfect corridor for death. The primary focus turned to the gap in the guardrail. Investigators returned to the site on Highway 70 with 2000-era construction logs and faded blueprints. They found that the construction firm, a now defunct entity called High Sierra Engineering, had bypassed standard safety protocols during a bridge widening project. At 2:30 p.m. on the day of the disappearance, a site supervisor had authorized the removal of the W-beam guardrail to allow a crane to pivot. They had replaced it with 3 orange plastic barrels filled with sand. To a structural engineer like Howard Miller, these were decorative at best. The forensic reconstruction of the physics showed that had the steel rail been in place, the Miller's sedan would have suffered a moderate impact, a crumpled fender, and a harrowing story to tell at the family reunion. Instead, the river was gifted an open door. The narrative truth is often found in these margins, the difference between a $19.99 piece of hardware and a 13-year mystery. As the legal investigation deepened, the forensic casual lens turned toward the metadata of a marriage. Among the items recovered from the interior were 4 rolls of undeveloped 35mm film, found in a waterproof casing in Martha's bag. The lab technicians used a specialized chemical bath to stabilize the silver halide crystals that had been submerged for 4,800 days. The images that emerged were static-filled and ghostly, but they provided a time-stamped journey into the heart of the tragedy. At 11:02 a.m., a photo of Howard smiling at a scenic overlook. At 1:15 p.m., a blurred shot of the diner menu. The final frame, captured likely by accident or a sudden jolt, showed only the dashboard and the darkening sky through the windshield. It was a macro shot of fear. The expert victim focuses on the gear, but the photos focus on the people. Martha's hands, visible in the reflection of the glass, were gripping the edge of the seat. She knew. The mountains don't explain why a moment of beauty at 11:02 a.m. becomes a tomb by 2:44 p.m., but the film provides a visual bridge across the void. The grieving investigator spent weeks staring at these photos, looking for a sign of hesitation, a reason to stop. He found none. They were moving toward their fate with the steady, rhythmic confidence of those who believe the world is built on solid ground. The social aftermath of the discovery was a slow burn of public fascination and private horror. The local community of Quincy, California, which had lived with the quote 28 for a decade, had to reconcile the mystery with the mundane reality of the recovery. The rule of irony was once again cited by the local press. The Millers were found not by a high-tech government task force, but by a 22-year-old diver who was looking for a lost wedding ring. The quote 29 now does hook was no longer a theory, it was a news cycle. But for the family, the narrative truth was more complex. They had to confront the reality of quote 30. Quote, this was the technical term for the distance between the final 2001 search grid and the actual location of the car. If the sonar operator had tilted the transducer by just 3 degrees, the mystery would have ended in year 1. This realization brought a new wave of grief, the knowledge that their loved ones had been sitting in the riverbed just out of reach for 4,000 consecutive nights. The mountains keep their secrets, but sometimes they keep them just an arm's length away. The legal battle over the accident or intent status reached its peak when the insurance company questioned Howard's state of mind. They pointed to the meticulous logs and the emergency kit as evidence of a man who might have been overwhelmed by the weight of his own order. This is the open-loop question. Could a man so prepared simply stop? The grieving investigator fought back with the evidence of the bent key and the shifted gears. A man who wants to leave the world doesn't fight the river with his bare hands. He doesn't downshift into the dark. The forensic image of the gear assembly, locked in the low position, was the final piece of testimony. Howard was an engineer until the water stopped his heart. He was solving the problem of the slide until the physics became insurmountable. The mountains don't explain why, but the gears do. They tell a story of a struggle that lasted seconds and a silence that lasted years. Imagine you are standing in that Sacramento warehouse as the final crate is sealed. The personal effects, the spectacles, the atlas, the ham sandwiches in wax paper are being returned to the family. You realize that the quote 35 is a myth we tell ourselves to feel safe. We buy the best tires, we check the weather, we map the route, but we are all just 3.8 seconds away from the river. The moral warning of the Miller case is not about safety, but about the fragility of the structures we build. We build guardrails of steel and we build guardrails of routine. Both can fail. Both can be removed by a careless hand or a sudden storm. The chronicler looks at the rusted sedan and sees a monument to the unplannable. No signal, no trace, just the slow, methodical passage of time in the silt. The water has been drained, the car has been crushed, and the files have been closed. But in the Feather River Canyon, the gap in the guardrail has been repaired with new shining steel. It reflects the sun, a bright reminder that the world tries to fix its mistakes, even if it takes 13 years to find them. The final phase of the Miller case is what we call justice through memory. It is the transition from the cold, analytical reality of the forensic lab to the permanent, melancholic residence of the story in our collective psyche. In the autumn of 2013, after the warehouses were cleared and the insurance litigation settled into the quiet archives of the state, the family finally held a memorial. There were no bodies to view, only the closed caskets that represented a 13-year absence. At the service, the grieving investigator David spoke not of the tragedy, but of the granular excellence of his uncle and aunt. He spoke of the tire pressure logs in the library books. He spoke of the rule of irony, though he didn't call it that. He called it the burden of the prepared. He noted that Howard and Martha lived their lives as if they could account for every variable, and in the end, the only variable they couldn't account for was the indifference of the river. This is the moral warning that echoes through the canyon. The mountains don't care how well you've mapped them. They were buried in a small cemetery in Salem, the same town they had left at 9:14 a.m. on that Tuesday in April. The loop was finally closed, not with a bang, but with the soft thud of earth on wood. The legacy of the Miller disappearance, however, extended far beyond the graveyard. In the world of search and rescue, the 42-meter miss became a case study taught at the National Academy. It led to a fundamental shift in how we interpret sonar data in high-relief environments. We no longer trust a flat reading in a canyon. We look for the acoustic shadow, the ghost in the machine that suggests something is hiding in the silt. The technical term is volumetric density analysis, but in the field they call it the Miller sweep. It is a methodical, slow-burn approach to searching that assumes the expert victim has been hidden by their own competence. Because of Howard and Martha, the next couple that slides into a river might be found in 13 days instead of 13 years. This is the justice through memory, the idea that their silence brought a louder voice for the lost of the future. The Highway Department also faced its reckoning. The gap in the guardrail on Highway 70 was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a systemic failure in construction oversight. Today, every temporary removal of a safety barrier must be logged with GPS coordinates and a time-stamped photo, the very kind of metadata Howard would have appreciated. The road is safer now, but it is a safety built on the rusted frame of a 1998 sedan. Imagine you are standing on that bridge today, 13 years after the discovery and 26 years after the disappearance. The water of the Feather River is a deep, translucent emerald. If you look closely at a specific bend in the river, just past the concrete pillar, you can still see a slight discoloration on the rocks. It is iron oxide, the blood of a car. It is all that remains of the Millers' physical presence in the canyon. The mountains keep their secrets, but they also leave scars. We obsess over these details because we want to believe that if we understand the physics of the hydroplaning or the chemistry of the film stabilization, we can somehow prevent our own vanishing. But the chronicler knows better. The chronicler knows that the narrative truth is not a shield, it is a eulogy. We are all just travelers moving at 60 miles per hour toward a microburst we cannot see. We trust the wipers, we trust the logs, and we trust the highlighter line on the map. We have to, because the alternative is to never leave the driveway at 9:14 a.m. The final entry in the forensic file of Howard and Martha Miller is a photograph of the riverbed taken 1 year after the car was removed. The silt has already filled the depression where the sedan sat. The freshwater mussels have moved on to new rocks. The vegetation has grown back over the spot where the car entered the trees. The void has been filled by the world. It is a haunting, melancholic image of a world that does not miss us. The experts have gone home. The grieving investigator has stopped calling the police station. The metadata has been archived. What remains is the rhetorical echo. The mountains don't explain why. They only provide the silence. And in that silence we find the only truth that matters. They were together until the very end. Howard's hand on the gear, Martha's hand on the seat, and the light switched to on in the dark. No signal, no trace, just a memory, meticulously recovered from the deep. The story of the Millers is a reminder that we are defined not by our arrival, but by the traces we leave in the silt. In the end, we are all just a collection of mundane items in a leather handbag, waiting for the water to recede. We are the receipts from lunch, the wire-rimmed spectacles, and the map with the yellow line. We are the expert victims of a world that is far more complex than our engineering. As you drive home tonight, through the rain or the dark, look at the guardrail, look at the wipers, look at the clock on the dashboard. And remember that the distance between a Tuesday afternoon and a 13-year mystery is only 3.8 seconds of water. Stay on the road, watch the shadows. The mountains are watching back.